Imagine a government receives more than 600 formal petitions from its own citizens, all asking it to reverse a single decision. Add to that a separate petition signed by thousands more. And the government's answer, after reviewing every single one, is still no. That is not a hypothetical. That happened very recently, over a satellite dish. And it tells you something far more important about Africa's digital future than the dish itself ever could. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what happened, why a regulator would say no to something its own public overwhelmingly wanted, and why this is not really a story about one billionaire or one company at all. It is a story about a question every African government is now being forced to answer. Who gets to own the infrastructure that connects a nation? Here is the tension at the heart of this. A regulator's job is to serve the public. And in this case, the public spoke about as loudly as a public can speak. Overwhelming support, hundreds of formal submissions, real frustration from people in rural areas who have waited years for reliable connectivity. But the regulator's job is also to enforce the law as written, not the law as the public might prefer it in a moment of frustration. And the law in question was not written carelessly. It exists because of a specific hard-won history, a determination that a country's most strategic infrastructure should not simply be handed over to whoever shows up with the best technology and the deepest pockets, foreign ownership and all. Picture a farmer in a remote district who has waited a decade for a reliable signal, watching her neighbor's satellite dish work perfectly, while her own application for legal service sits blocked by a rule she has never heard of and did not write. She is not wrong to be frustrated. And the regulator insisting on that rule is not wrong either. That is the genuine, uncomfortable middle this story sits in. So what exactly is this rule? Who is enforcing it? And why has it now produced two completely different outcomes in two neighboring countries? Let's get into the specifics. Key point 1. Namibia. A regulator that said no twice. The country at the center of this is Namibia, and the company is Starlink, SpaceX's satellite internet service. In March 2026, Namibia's Communications Regulatory Authority, CRAN, rejected Starlink's application for both a telecommunications service license and the radio spectrum license it would need to operate legally. CRAN. Rejection was not vague. The regulator assessed the application against 6 specific legal criteria. Starlink met 3: competition, technical capability, and frequency availability. It failed 3 others: ownership and control, national defense and public security, and compliance history. On ownership specifically, Namibia's Communications Act requires telecommunications operators to be at least 51% locally owned, unless the minister grants an exemption. Starlink's local entity remained entirely foreign-owned, and no exemption was sought or granted. On compliance history, CRAN pointed to Starlink having operated in the country without authorization in 2024, leading to confiscated equipment, and to the company's failure to respond to a regulatory summons. What happened next is the part the original story everyone has been discussing actually missed. Following the March rejection, CRAN received 624 separate requests for reconsideration from members of the Namibian public, alongside a separate petition signed by 5,500 citizens. Starlink itself confirmed that 98.6% of public comments during the consultation process supported its application. This was not a quiet bureaucratic dispute. This was a regulator standing against an overwhelming wave of public sentiment. And on June 22nd, 2026, just days before this video, CRAN CEO Emilian Gikembua confirmed the authority had dismissed the reconsideration appeal entirely. Of the 624 public requests, 622 failed to meet the legal threshold required to even trigger a review. The remaining 2 were considered on their merits and rejected anyway, with CRAN finding no new evidence and no material error in the original decision. Starlink's own request, filed by the company directly, was thrown out on a technicality. It arrived 16 days after the 30-day statutory deadline had expired. Key point 2, South Africa. The same standoff, a different strategy. Across the border, South Africa is fighting a strikingly similar battle, but choosing a different path entirely. South Africa's Electronic Communications Act requires telecommunications licensees to have at least 30% ownership by historically disadvantaged groups, the country's black economic empowerment framework. Starlink has stated it cannot meet this through direct equity, citing global shareholding restrictions that apply across all 164 markets where it operates. Elon Musk, who was born in Pretoria, has called the rule discriminatory, claiming on his own platform that he is effectively excluded because he is not black, and separately describing the ownership laws as what he termed apartheid in reverse. President Cyril Ramaphosa has rejected that framing directly, arguing the laws exist specifically to address the legacy of apartheid-era discrimination, not to recreate it. Rather than fighting the ownership rule head-on, the way Namibia's CRAN has, South Africa's Communications Minister, Solly Malatsi, has tried a workaround. In December 2025, he issued a formal policy directive instructing the regulator ICASA to recognize equity-equivalent investment programs, EEIPs, as an alternative to the 30% equity rule, allowing companies to invest in skills development, local infrastructure, and enterprise support instead of selling shares. Starlink has signaled support, reportedly offering to commit roughly 2 billion rand, about $110 million, toward local infrastructure if the path is approved. But in May 2026, ICASA told the minister it could not fully implement his directive without an actual amendment to the underlying Electronic Communications Act itself, a formal parliamentary process that legal analysts now expect could take years, not months, and faces vocal opposition from several coalition partners, including threats of legal action. As of this recording, no formal Starlink license application has even been submitted in South Africa, and a legitimate license launch is now widely considered unlikely before 2027. Key point 3, Uganda. Proof that a different outcome is possible. Here is the detail that gives this story real strategic weight rather than just drama. This is not actually a story about Starlink being incompatible with African regulation. Uganda proves otherwise. Uganda initially blocked Starlink too, but the two sides eventually reached a workable agreement, one that required Starlink to establish a national gateway, routing all of its internet traffic through local infrastructure, register every device operating in the country, maintain a physical office staffed with local technical and legal personnel, and comply fully with local tax obligations. Starlink agreed and now operates legally in Uganda. That comparison matters enormously. It tells us this is not a story of an immovable company versus immovable governments. It is a story about which specific conditions each government has decided are genuinely non-negotiable and whether the company is willing to meet them. Namibia decided ownership and national security oversight were non-negotiable. Uganda decided traffic localization and accountability infrastructure were the real priority and was willing to be more flexible on the rest. Two very different bargains, two very different outcomes, with the exact same company on the other side of the table. So what does this all actually mean for how we should think about digital sovereignty across the continent? Here's the bigger picture, the strategic insight. Here is the strategic reframe I want every regulator and policymaker watching this to hold on to. This is not fundamentally a story about Elon Musk versus Africa. That framing is dramatic, but it flattens something far more consequential. What is actually happening is that African governments, almost simultaneously, are being forced to answer a question that connectivity policy has mostly avoided until now. When a piece of national digital infrastructure can be deployed from orbit, beyond the easy reach of local courts and local enforcement, what does sovereignty over that infrastructure actually require? Namibia's answer is that ownership and security oversight are the non-negotiable core, even at real political cost, even against overwhelming public pressure. South Africa's answer so far is to try to thread a path between two valid priorities: historical economic transformation and the desire to extend connectivity quickly, without yet finding consensus on how. Uganda's answer is that the conditions matter more than the ownership structure itself. None of these three approaches is obviously wrong. They are three different, genuine answers to the same hard sovereignty question. And the rest of the continent is watching all three unfold in real time. So, if you're a regulator watching three different models play out in real time, what should you actually take from each of them? Here are 5 things worth taking seriously. The practical takeaways. 1. Decide your non-negotiables before the application arrives, not during the public backlash. Namibia's position has been consistent and procedurally defensible precisely because the ownership rule predates this specific dispute. Regulators who improvise criteria under public pressure lose credibility, regardless of which way they ultimately rule. 2. Consider whether equity-equivalent mechanisms can serve your underlying policy goal as well as direct ownership can. South Africa's EEIP proposal is a genuine attempt to ask whether the goal is ownership itself or the economic transformation that ownership was meant to deliver. That is a legitimate question for any country with similar empowerment legislation to examine honestly on its own merits, rather than assuming only one answer is acceptable. 3. Study Uganda's negotiated conditions model closely. Requiring a national gateway, local device registration, and a staffed local office gives a government meaningful oversight and accountability without necessarily demanding an ownership stake. It is a template worth examining for any country trying to balance speed of access against sovereignty concerns. 4. Treat public consultation results honestly in both directions. Namibia consulted the public, received overwhelming support for approval, and still ruled against it because the legal criteria were unmet. That is not a failure of consultation. It is what genuine rule of law looks like. Regulators should be prepared to do the same in either direction, rather than treating popularity as a legal argument. 5. Coordinate as a continent before each country relitigates the same fight alone. Every African nation negotiating with LEO satellite operators is currently doing so bilaterally, with limited visibility into what neighboring countries have already negotiated. A shared continental reference framework, even an informal one, would strengthen every individual country's negotiating position. Conclusion: 98.6% public support. A regulator that still said no, twice. That is not a story about one stubborn institution standing in the way of progress. It is a story about a continent deciding, country by country, what digital sovereignty is actually going to mean in practice. Not in theory, not in a policy paper, but in a real decision with real political cost attached to it. Make sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.